Welcome everyone to our Zoom webinar on the new report we're releasing today on countering Iran in the gray zone, lessons for the United States from Israel's campaign in Syria. What we'll do is we'll begin with a presentation from myself, from Nicholas Heras at the Institute for the Study of War and a longtime colleague of ours previously at CNAS, and Kaleigh Thomas, my colleague at CNAS, on this report. Just a couple of ground rules. The event will be on the record. At the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A function, which is available on the webcast at the bottom of your screen. We're only going to accept questions through writing through the Q&A button, and then we'll field them, consolidate, and answer as many as we can. So feel free to submit those questions throughout the presentation, but understand this is going to be on the record. We're going to take this video and post it online. We're also going to post it as a webcast. So if you ask a question, we may identify you by name as the person asking the question. So just understand it's all an on the record discussion. I think that is sort of it on the sort of ground rules and logistical front. Kaleigh, am I missing anything or anything else we should warn our viewers about, or did I catch it all?
I think you caught it all, Ilan.
Great. All right. Thank you. Well, in that case, let's move on and start talking about what we're going to talk about today. So basically, over a year ago, a number of us were in Israel and received a briefing from the IDF about the campaign that they've been conducting in Syria over the last few years, what they call the campaign between the wars. And I think we can put the slides up, by the way, at this point. The campaign between the wars, or in Hebrew, Mabam. And we were blown away by the extent of the campaign itself. We're talking about multiple hundreds of strikes on Iranian targets inside of Syria. And frankly, if you told me or you told most analysts that Israel was going to do something like this, hit hundreds of targets inside of Iranian targets inside of Syria, I would have told you, yeah, and there's going to be a big war afterwards. And I think most analysts would have said that, but there hasn't been. And we thought that was pretty interesting. And we thought to ask ourselves, what have the Israelis done? Why hasn't it caused a conflict? Has it been effective at countering Iran's operations inside Syria? And most importantly for the United States, are there things we can learn in terms of how we deal with Iran sort of in the gray zone based on the Israeli experience? And to be honest, there's a track record of the United States learning from Israel on these types of operations, most notably after the 1973 war, after the Yom Kippur War, the US studied Israeli tank warfare and its conflict with a number of the Arab states who were mostly supported by the Soviet Union to understand how it would conduct potential warfare with the Soviet Union. And so in the same way, we thought that there are lessons out of what Israel has done, for how we deal with Iran in the gray zone, and also how we deal potentially with Russia, China, other gray zone conflicts writ large. I do want to say one thing before we start, and here I'm just speaking for myself, but what this is not is, an endorsement of escalating conflict with Iran. Especially, this research started before the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, what I would really personally, myself, like to see today is de-escalation. I would much rather see at this moment the US relaxing some sanctions so that Iran, has what it needs in terms of medical equipment and supplies to fight this virus. I'd like to see Iranian proxies and surrogates in Iraq not attacking American forces and refraining from conflict. But the study is still important despite the moment that we are in, both in terms of how we might conduct these operations in the future, and more importantly, if we are going to be in this type of cycle, how we can be smart about it and do it in a way that actually achieves American objectives while avoiding escalation, which is what the Israelis seem to have been able to do. So with that, why don't I turn to the next slide and just quickly tell you what we're going to do. Basically, what we're going to do now for the next 20 minutes or half an hour is Nick will start by walking us through the Israeli campaign and the history there and what they've done. And then Kaleigh and I will go through and brief you on what we thought were some of the key lessons from the campaign. And after that, we'll turn to Q&A. I think we'll start actually Q&A with a comment from Sarit Zahavi, who is the director of the Alma Research and Education Center, which is a think tank based in northern Israel that focuses on these issues and was a partner of ours and very helpful in some of the research that we did. And after that, we'll turn to broader Q&A from the audience. So with that, let me turn it over to Nick.
Thank you very much, Ilan, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this important and timely discussion. I'm going to walk the group through sort of the history of Israel's campaign between the wars, or MABA, as the acronym is in Hebrew, and also some of the key features of that campaign and what it means for where we stand now. The campaign between the wars has been a carefully managed Israeli operation that, for all intents and purposes, began soon after the Syrian conflict started in 2012. There are certain key time periods throughout that campaign in which we've seen a gradual escalation of Israeli activities inside of Syria to prevent Iran from transferring weapons to Lebanese Hezbollah, to prevent Iran and its proxy network from creating a forward operating base from Syria with which to strike Israel, and where we stand now with a question as to how far Israel may widen the aperture of its campaign. It's important to point out that the campaign between the wars began to heat up in 2013. In 2013, Major General Amir Eshel, at the time the IDF's Air Force chief, actually previewed Israeli thinking on the campaign between the wars. He said, "Israel is fighting a campaign between the wars, and Israel is doing its utmost to keep our efforts beneath the level at which war breaks out." Certain key features of the Israeli campaign as it developed were to attack and neutralize potential threats to Israel proactively, and before these threats mass on Israel's border, to deter Iran and its proxy network indefinitely in order to postpone a larger conflict with Iran, to set the conditions for Israel to win a war with Iran and its proxies if a war breaks out by treating Iran's military infrastructure, both in terms of weapons capabilities and its personnel and proxy fighters in Syria. As you can see from the timeline, this has been a long campaign and it has stretched over the better part of a decade. Prior to 2017, when the Assad regime, supported by Iran and its proxy network, ended the Battle of Aleppo successfully and captured all of Aleppo, Israeli concerns were mainly focused on using a carefully managed air campaign to prevent the transfer of advanced weapons from Iran to Lebanese Hezbollah, which includes guided missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, and shore-to-sea missiles, as well as to prevent chemical weapons from being transferred from the Assad regime to Lebanese Hezbollah via the IRGC. After 2017, Israel's campaign between the wars expanded in order to prevent Iran from building the capability to transfer precision-guided munitions to Lebanese Hezbollah, to develop a large proxy force, and to prevent Syria from being a base of attack against Israel. Next slide, please. One of the key dynamics, there are certain key inflection points in Israel's campaign against Iran in Syria. In June 2013, Lebanese Hezbollah played a key role in capturing the Lebanese-Syrian border city of Qusair, which secured the IRGC's ground lines of communications between Syria and Lebanon. In 2015, on the Syrian side of the Golan, a senior Lebanese Hezbollah operative, Jihad Mughniya, was killed via Israeli airstrike, which showed that Iran was not only using Syrian territory as a transit zone for weapons to Hezbollah, but was using the Golan as a potential staging ground to apply pressure on Israel. In February 2018, the IRGC demonstrated its capability to launch armed drones from deep inside Syria, in particular, the T4 airbase run by the Assad regime deep in the Syrian desert in Homs province, which led to a large-scale Israeli response. And in July 2019, we see the expansion of Israeli strikes into Iraq, which were acknowledged actually this year in January by Israel's chief of the general staff, Avi Kohavi, who said Israel has carried out actions in Iraq. Iranian weapons are being transferred freely from Iraq. We cannot let it go without addressing it. What this means is that Israel has carefully tried to calibrate its campaign in Syria as a means to deter and detrite the IRGC, its proxy network. However, there are questions moving forward as to how long that can be maintained. Next slide, please. In sum total, Israel has carried out over 1,000 strikes, over 200 strikes against 1,000 targets, and to this point has not suffered any killed in action. The result of that has been a slow burn in approach and to try to remove Iran from its entrenchment in Syria and to maintain the threshold of conflict below war. Thank you. On to Kaleigh.
So with that, the first lesson to learn from the Mabon campaign that Israel conducted over the past few years and continues to conduct is to focus on clearly defined and limited objectives. As Nick outlined in his introduction of this campaign, it was designed to achieve a discrete purpose as part of Israel's overall strategy vis-a-vis Iran. So this campaign was intended to roll back Iran's ability to directly threaten Israel through proxy networks and weapons transfers into and via Syrian territory, with a particular focus on inhibiting Iran's transfer of precision-guided munitions into Syria and Lebanon. And this clear objective, with this, Israel was able to send very clear signals to those actors involved in Syria at the time without escalating the situation into a larger scale conflict. So it became very clear to Iran, Russia, as well as the Assad regime, that Israel's targeting would be highly limited and narrowly focused in such that it was tied to these discrete objectives, lowering the risk of escalation into full-out war. And this lesson is one that can be easily and should be applied to American objectives vis-a-vis Iran. Currently, American objectives are quite broad in their aim to simply eliminate or reduce Iranian influence in Iraq and Syria writ large. A more narrow objective associated with a campaign conception, for example, deterring Shia militia attacks against US forces in Iraq, or deterring mine attacks against international oil shipping, or even deterring missile attacks against Saudi oil infrastructure. These more narrow concepts of operation would meet the need to send very clear signals to Iran and other actors in the region without escalating the situation into further conflict. So adopting this lesson would be a key first step for the US and would allow the United States to adopt some of the other lessons that we'll discuss further on in this presentation. So with that, let's move on to lesson 2.
Sorry, I was muted there. I started speaking while muted. Lesson 2 basically emphasizes intelligence and military superiority, and the Israelis are very clear about this. In Syria, the Israelis have a huge operational advantage over Iran because they've been operating in Syria basically since 1948 in one form or another, and are right on the border, whereas Iran is a few hundred miles removed and frankly hasn't been as involved in Syria until the last few years. There's a relationship has already been there, but the military role that Iran played in Syria dramatically expanded, especially after 2011 and the start of the civil war. And so for the Israelis, they have such an in-depth level of intelligence that for every single strike that they conduct, they go through a very long list of targets and how every single actor inside Syria might respond. And by doing that, oftentimes we really think things through. What kind of strike will work? Does it have to be public? Can it be quiet? All these things go into that, factoring in how your adversary might respond in the political reality. Doesn't mean that they get it always right, but that type of process, I think, limits risk. I mean, there's some examples where they really haven't gotten it right. Most notably when they inadvertently had a shoot down of a Russian airplane as part of, by Syrian air defenses after an Israeli incursion. But this does at least reduce the risk. And on top of that, Israel's military superiority has meant that when Iran has tried to retaliate against Israel, for example, by sending drones from Syria into Israel, those have been shot down. They failed to have a meaningful effect. The U.S. is also perfectly capable of establishing this type of military and intelligence superiority in various arenas. But the reality is it's very expensive, for a global superpower to do that everywhere in the world, or to do that in any one place and to put the level of resources necessary. For the Israelis, it's pretty straightforward. They have 3 or 4 key arenas, and this is one of them. And so they've put the necessary resources behind it. We have to ask ourselves when we're countering Iran, where are the arenas where it's worth actually doing this as a global superpower, or where are we better off where we don't have this type of superiority, so we should not be engaging in these types of operations. So now on back to Kaleigh.
The third lesson is that in conducting such a campaign, Israel and any other country who tries to conduct a similar campaign must possess a willingness to take calculated risks. So American policymakers in the past, for many presidents, have fallen into a trap looking at potential military activities as having a binary risk, either kind of falling into all-out conflict or taking such conservative action that there's no conflict or confrontation at all. Simultaneously, one president after another has also argued that in the Middle East, it's in the US interest to counter Iran, but rarely have we done so in a military fashion, mostly out of the fear of triggering an all-out war. So for years, there were no serious US responses to Iranian actions, even just looking over the course of the past year to strikes at Americans in Iraq, mining attacks on ships in the Gulf of Oman, and the missile strikes on Saudi oil infrastructure, notably Abqaiq and Corée. Instead, the Americans were deterred from responding to those attacks out of concerns that would cause an outsized Iranian response. And when the United States finally did respond, it took that risk too far, going way over the top and ultimately nearly causing a war with the strike on Qasem Soleimani. So while there needs to be a willingness to take risk, that should be more well calibrated to see the spectrum of action that can be taken in the gray zone, so that taking risks does not mean being reckless. So now on to the next lesson.
Sure, and so a real key component, maybe the most important definitional component in my mind of the Israeli operation, but not the only one, has been the Israeli public messaging around it. For the most part, many of the strikes have gone unacknowledged and are deniable, and that serves the function of not embarrassing the Iranians or forcing them to feel like they have to respond, or the Russians, or the Assad regime, or anybody else. But even as the Israelis do this, they do find ways to drip things into the public domain, whether it's through, mysteriously stories showing up in Arab newspapers, or sometimes images of, bomb or facilities that are producing these types of weapons showing up on the web through a private organization or an outside analyst. Both in order to send a signal to the Iranians about what it is they're targeting and what their intentions are, but also to send messages to the world that, they're not just blowing up empty warehouses, like there's a real issue here and they have the proof. And so that's been a pretty effective calibration the Israelis have managed to conduct. It's easier for them also because they have a military censor, so that whenever they need to, they can sort of stop the press from doing that. For the United States, in contrast, the Soleimani strike represents an example where we did the exact opposite. I mean, that's this picture of the president speaking after the strike. We tweet American flag right after doing it. We make lots of phone calls to allies and partners in the region and put out very public readouts of those discussions. We do all kinds of things that basically make it impossible for the Iranians to not respond to us. So the question is, could we do this not as well as the Israelis? Because again, we have we have a much more robust, I think we have a more robust free press, frankly, that's not going to be censored. And that's fine. But there have been examples where the US conducted these types of operations against non-state actors, whether it's countering Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, or countering Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, where there was this kind of deniable and yet kind of known campaign going on. And I think you could see something similar here. It'd be a much smarter way, I think, to try to counter Iran without unnecessarily provoking conflict. So now back to the next lesson.
Another key element of Israel's signaling as part of this campaign was purposely limiting adversary and civilian casualties. So Israel has gone out of its way in some strikes, even purposely missing with the first shot in order to let any operatives who were there to operate the military infrastructure to scatter out before then destroying the infrastructure itself. And in doing this, they have lessened the need for Iran or any Iranian or associated forces to then respond to this strike. In contrast, we saw this past December when the United States responded to escalation with Iran. It launched, 5 strikes against Kataib Hezbollah sites in Iraq and Syria, which resulted in 25 fighters who were killed. And this was seen by Iran and associated forces as a significant escalation in response to the death of only one US contractor the previous day. So instead of sending a strong deterrence signal, this operation led an escalation in the form of the attack on the US embassy, which led to the American response of killing Qasem Soleimani, and then nearly brought the US and Iran into a conflict in the days that followed. The United States military has the capability to limit and should try to limit casualties when conducting strikes in the gray zone in an effort to prevent such an escalation from happening. And part of the US effort to do this will have to involve basing its analysis, as Israel does, and more contextual information on a given target, and being very purposeful in that signaling to Iran and other forces. So with that, let's go to the next lesson.
All right, another thing that the Israelis did that was pretty interesting, as the United States, traditionally, the way we think of military planning is first identify the end state and then work backwards from there to conduct your campaign. The Israelis really did not do that in this case, and I think that this might be a lesson for us to think about as we conduct both this type of gray zone campaign against Iran, but also if we were to conduct gray zone campaigns against Russia, China, others, as you're sort of thinking about this slow edging into the gray zone and testing your adversaries' reactions. What the Israelis basically did is, they started with a forward planning process of, we're going to try, 1 strike or 2 strikes and do it very carefully with the most risk-averse target and see how all the different actors respond. And then based on that, and the response, we're going to iterate and come back and improve. And if we got no response, we're going to try to maybe push a little bit forward further to try to achieve more of our objectives, and back and forth in this iterative process, a bit like boiling the classic boiling of a frog. I think this is something that worked very well for them. And it also gets you out of the box of being afraid of not doing, anything for fear of either triggering the worst case outcome at the very end, or not knowing exactly 100% where it's going. You have to be willing to say, we're going to achieve some limited small objectives along the way, which is generally more of an Israeli mentality than an American mentality. You know, and so I think this is something we're perfectly capable of doing as the United States if we, you know, just actively think about it that way, and have done in some cases, especially in the middle of active conflict. The ISIS campaign being a good example where we kind of, you know, through testing stumbled into an approach at least that worked with, you know, supporting local Kurdish partners. And also the question also becomes the United States, again, as a global superpower. We sometimes play a longer game, so this approach doesn't necessarily make as much sense for us in every example as a sort of smaller player that's got a lot of problems on all of its borders. But it's something for our military planners to definitely consider, you know, as they look at, you know, ways to counter Iran and similar conflicts. So that's it for lesson 6. Back over to Kaleigh.
So for lesson 7, the penultimate lesson, one of the more interesting things about these Israelis' Mabam operation is the fact that it was taking place in Syria, where there were so many actors involved, and therefore it would appear that the risk of escalation would be even higher. So the Israelis obviously were not conducting this operation in a vacuum, but instead had to, you know, pursue aggressive diplomacy in order to help maintain a permissible political environment by which they could continue to have the space to maneuver and to conduct this campaign, and to do so with the discreet approach that they had. And so Israel notably established a military-to-military deconfliction line with Russians. And this diplomacy with Russia started at the very high level between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Vladimir Putin of Russia, who met roughly 12 times over the past 3 years while this campaign was ongoing. And that high-level diplomacy then trickled down to more of the operational level, so that while there were some instances of mistakes and Russian interference, that mainly Israel was able to maintain this freedom to operate. So when thinking about US operations in the region, especially to counter Iran, it's important for Americans and US forces to also pursue rigorous diplomacy with local players who impact our space to maneuver. And so in this case, the Russians almost might be best equated to the Iraq government and engaging with diplomacy with them. The Russians did not want to end up in the middle of an Iran-Israel conflict, so Israel was actually to leverage that into this de-escalation and to manage the situation. Similarly, the Iraqi government wants no part of a US-Iran large-scale confrontation. They're okay with the US military presence as long as it's not fueling that conflict and putting Iraqis at risk or embarrassing them with their people. So a smart diplomatic strategy for the United States would be constant engagement with the Iraqis to diffuse this problem instead of striking targets or ending up in this escalation ladders without notifying the Iraqis, or with having a complementary diplomacy ongoing in that open conversation. So overall, one of the main takeaways, because this can be applied with Iraq, but also with some of the United States Gulf partners in the region, is to consult with allies first before making public statements about Iran's actions, to ensure coordinated messaging as well as possible military responses. And with that, let's go to Ilan for the final lesson.
Sure, and this final lesson also gets at least at a question I saw pop up in the Q&A, even though I'm not supposed to be the manager of the Q&A, from Norm Rule, about like the reality that this is more tactical and not necessarily strategic in achieving its objectives. And I think that needs to be something that we keep in mind throughout. The verdict on this entire campaign is still very much out. You know, it has definitely slowed Iran's ability to put weapons and sophisticated weaponry into Syria. There's no doubt about that. But the Iranians have pivoted to try and do other things, put more weapons into Iraq or into Lebanon, which are more complicated for Israel to strike at. You know, to take a more patient approach in Syria, for example, and build out stronger relationships with Shia militias there, that over time they can try to, you know, put these weapons in later. And the reality is that, you know, there is an element to this which is simply mowing the lawn, as the term has sometimes been used. So I think that we need to be realistic about these types of expectations. They don't replace, a broader U.S. strategy towards Iran, which in my view would need to involve, diplomatic negotiation, engagement, but also pushback and pressure on areas where we disagree. So this can't be the solution. But, if you use it smart and you use it careful, and you use it the way the Israelis have used it in situations where it makes sense, it can be a useful tool, all right? It can't be a strategy, but it can be a tool that can be wielded more effectively than the United States has wielded it in the past, where we've either tried to wield it as a hammer or just like taken it off the board altogether, both of which don't necessarily work. So with that, why don't we just go to the last slide on just some conclusions about what this, just thinking about applying some of these lessons to the United States, a couple of wrap-up words, after which we'll turn to Sarit Zahavi for a couple of minutes, and then keep getting your, I see a long list of questions already coming in, so I think we'll have a great conversation. I think for me, the bottom line with all of this is a couple of things. Like one, what the Israeli campaign does demonstrate is that there's more freedom of action than maybe we've thought about if we get more creative. I mean, even if you just compare, the types of options that the Pentagon put in front of the president in 2013 after the, really the early years of the Syrian civil war, where everything was being presented as, 70,000 troops and no-fly zones and very broad options. Or you do nothing. Like there is more space in there if you're creative in these types of situations where you can avoid conflict but try to achieve your objective. So I think that's one lesson, is not to just always go to the black or white. But the other question for the U.S. is is any president going to ever really be willing to take the risks associated with this? I mean, these ideas are not necessarily brand new. A lot of them have been executed at various times by the United States. Mostly they aren't executed by the United States. And oftentimes when these options are put in front of American presidents, they just say, no, this is not worth it. It's too risky. I don't necessarily want to see where it goes. And so it might just be that, we're not necessarily primed to conduct this kind of campaign. And also is a question institutionally, what kind of authority is associated with some of these strikes, where I think there does need to be both a lot of clarity and a lot of transparency, but at the same time, some of this does need to be covert. That's complicated to do. A much more vigorous press, and also, again, the Israelis, part of the reason they've been able to do this is their very, very deep knowledge of this arena. We don't, as a global superpower that's further stretched, we don't have sometimes that same level of knowledge, or necessarily, we can always develop it. We have the resources to do it, but is it really worth it to us? So I really think the bottom line of all of this is there are definitely lessons to learn. It's an interesting campaign. It's worth studying further. It's worth the US military in particular taking more time to study it and look at some of the conclusions and the intelligence community that have come out of this campaign. But at the same time, it's not just like a cut and paste onto the United States. We are different. And in many cases, this won't necessarily make as much sense for us. And so we need to think through that as well, as opposed to just saying, well, the Israelis did it and so that we can do it and it makes sense for us. So maybe I'll stop there. And maybe if Sarit is on the line, we can turn to her, for an initial response from an Israeli perspective as somebody who, has spent a lot of time studying this, this conflict and sort of this operations.
Hi, for me, it's good afternoon. I'll just open it for video. How do I do that? Or you can open it for video for me.
I'm not sure you're going to be able to open it for video, Sarit. Why don't you go ahead? I think people can hear you.
Yes.
Sure, no problem. So first, as an Israeli, I must emphasize that we don't have the option to do nothing. And that's why we had to develop this gray zone into a strategy much more than just a tactic, because it's either war, which is a bad option for us, it will affect our lives deeply, or doing nothing. And we had to develop something in between. A second note is that I agree that in most cases, the Mabam or the gray zone campaign will not achieve dealing with strategic goals such as, I don't know, defeating Iran, changing the regime, whatever. But I can think of one example that I can consider it Mabam, which is the Israeli attack against the nuclear capabilities of Syria in 2007. And again, in this attack, we used the ambiguity policy, and actually we admitted attacking this place only 10 years later. And it didn't take us into war thanks to this ambiguity policy. So the ambiguity policy is very important. It enables us sometimes even to gain strategic goals by this gray zone campaign, but it's not an ideology. And this is very important to remember, because you mentioned that there was a debate in Israel whether we must continue the non-acknowledgement policy and not admitting that we are doing anything in Syria, or whether we should a little bit talk about it like our leaders did actually since 2019. I think the ambiguity policy is a tool, and we should use it when it's necessary. And we can also do other stuff when it's necessary for deterrence, because sometimes it's important to come and say, yes, we had done that, and it creates much more deterrence. We can take the risk there, if I'm using your words about calculated risks. As for the issue of the media, I wouldn't give too much credit to the military censorship in Israel, because they only can censor Israeli media, and eventually everything goes out by the media outside of Israel. In today's reality, everything goes out in social media. So I think that we understood that we cannot control the media, but we can influence the media. And this is what was done here, and it was done like the same way it is done with the kinetic attacks, meaning that we used intelligence, we used initiative and creativity, and we used targeting specific audiences or specific information that was designed for that. I think that the key word when we speak about gray zone is consistency. Very difficult word to pronounce for Israelis. Which is sometimes consistency is needed for more than one term of presidency. This consistency will enable creating red lines, creativity, flexibility, as all of these lessons that you actually talked about, containment of a crisis when things are not going exactly the way we wanted, but still you need to be very patient when you look at the achievements of this gray zone campaign. Sometimes you're not aware of the achievements the day after, only years later. If I'm looking at what the United States can do, I must say that the United States can adopt the gray zone campaign on a much wider area. We were looking at Syria. You should look at Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. You should take all of these in consideration, because anything you would do, Iran may retaliate in Saudi Arabia. And I'm not sure that the Iranian attack against Saudi Arabia oil infrastructure was not actually a retaliation about something that we don't know of. So, if I'm trying to look at the differences between Israel and the United States, Israel is a player on the playground. We are part of the conflict. We cannot choose to get out of the conflict whenever we want. The United States is an external player, and that's why it must coordinate this pressure diplomacy that you've mentioned must be done with many, many players in the scene. One word about Soleimani. Eventually, there was no war. So if there was no war, maybe this was also a calculated risk. And when you take calculated risks, you sometimes need to be prepared for casualties. And I'm saying prepared, not willing. I'm using a different verb because when you are prepared, you have better chances to avoid casualties. The best example is what happened here last September when Hezbollah launched anti-tank missiles to IDF vehicles and positions, and nobody got hurt. And it was not only thanks for luck. We were very much prepared to pull out the soldiers very quickly from the areas that were about to be attacked. One last thing, and I think it is connected to what we are experiencing today, which is the COVID-19. Iran is also having a gray zone campaign. And one of the key elements in the gray zone campaign of Iran is the civilian educational effort. Iran is working very hard to gain support and to gain influence in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in Syria by civilian means. Medical assistance, educational systems. And we see this clearly when we look at Lebanon with what's going on with Hezbollah and the campaign against the COVID-19. I think that this is something the United States can definitely do much better than Israel, reinforcing the civilian systems in those countries that will create a counter product to the Iranian systems by supplying completely civilian services or equipment to fight the COVID-19. This crisis is going to be long enough to create influence on this level. And one last sentence, as you mentioned, we are based in the North. Our Alma Center is based in the North. We are following what is happening on our borders. Next month, we are going to have a webinar about our report about the Golan File and the Iranian proxies in Syria next to our border. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Sarit. Yeah, and I think, I mean, so why don't we open it up to questions? Kaleigh, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. We have a lot of really good questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I think I'll start out with a couple that I've bucketed together on digging down into those differences between, you know, what Israel can do and what the United States can do. So really what is applicable. So two questions on that front. First, from Mitchell Hopberg, we have, is there a specific particular aspects of the configuration of Israel's national security bureaucracy and decision-making process that makes it difficult for the United States to replicate certain elements of this campaign? So maybe speaking to some specific examples there. And then another question from Thomas Warwick, more to the fundamental differences that potentially exist between US and Israel military goals vis-a-vis Iran. So I think Normal also brought this up in the questions, which is there's, you know, the bomb campaign was focused on largely degrading capabilities. The US seems to be focused more on like deterring attacks against personnel. So do those differences in goals mean that some of the lessons cannot be so directly applied? Back to you guys for those questions.
Well, Nick, maybe I can start on the Israeli, sort of bureaucratic and mention a little bit on Hezbollah, and then you can also hop in if you want. On the Israeli bureaucracy question, I mean, the first thing is the Israelis are smaller and more nimble as a result. Like, we are a much bigger national security bureaucracy. And there has been, given the sensitivity, I mean, there has been a certain level of micromanagement at pretty low levels on pretty much every strike has been very thoroughly reviewed. We also have the capacity to do that, and we do that. For example, we did that around not just the Soleimani strike, but the strikes that came before, the 5 on Kitab Hezbollah. but that starts to suck up like massive amounts of senior leader bandwidth if you're a global superpower focusing that narrowly on that question. So that's, I think, part of the question. The other is, again, goes back to how much in terms of intel resources do we really want to put towards this question? Yeah, I think that's enough. And military resources, do we really want to put towards this question? I think Sarit made this point, like Israel has no choice but to deal with the players it has in the neighborhood. We have, many more options. And so I think those are, to me, the two biggest ones. And then in terms of the differences between trying to deter Iran, deter versus degrade. I mean, there's a fair dose of deterrence also going on in the Israeli campaign, I would say. They're trying to degrade, but they're also trying, through degrading, trying to send a message about deterrence. I mean, and frankly, we have in the past had moments when we've done a pretty good job of deterring. I think about an example of, Iran moving IRAMs into Iraq in 2011 and the American response there, which was much more targeted and sent, I think, the right message, and that message got through to the Iranians. So I'm not sure that the difference between deter and degrade means fundamentally different campaigns. I actually think they can be somewhat similar. Nick, I don't know if you wanted to hop on any other responses on that.
Well, thank you, Ilan. Thank you for the questions. I agree with you that the line between deterrence and defense at times, or degradation, can be blurred. What we've observed over sort of the long haul of this campaign is that in most of you have to sort of divide it into sort of 2 or 3 theaters now: Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. In Lebanon, there's been much more of a deterrence factor, although you can make the argument that the IDF's campaign to remove the attack tunnels that Hezbollah and the IRGC had been building, from which to stage an invasion of the Galilee, was a form of defense. Whereas in Syria, there has been much more of an active defense, and the target packages also sort of determine where you are on the deterrence or defense, we'll say, rubric. When you're actively targeting weapons caches, you're actively targeting cross-border tunnels, when you're targeting commanders who are known for establishing kinetic lines of effort, that's more of an active defense. But when you are going after more high-level targets, intelligence sites, logistics sites, depots, that can be a form of deterrence. And I think there's been an oscillation throughout the campaign between the wars, between active defense and attempts at deterrence. And deterrence can also be the political line of effort, speaking to gray zone conflicts. And you see one parallel between the US effort in Iraq, for example, and the Israeli effort in Syria, is that the Israelis have utilized a parallel diplomatic and political line of effort via Russia to try to manage and deter Iran's entrenchment and activities in Syria, whereas the United States is also engaged in a parallel political effort to try to deter threats against it.
Great. This all leads well into the next bucket of questions that I see from our participants, which go more to how a narrow campaign like this, if the US were to replicate one, fits into a larger overall US-Iran strategy. So in that end, I know that Nick mentioned this and Alani mentioned this as well in the presentation, that the bomb campaign has not yet ended, and so the how it ends and to the degree to which it is successfully contributing to an overall Israel-Iran strategy is a little bit on the more wishy-washy side. So in the context of a US strategy vis-a-vis Iran, do we end up in sort of a forever war, endless, series of operations like this? And then how does that impact potential space for re-engaging Iran diplomatically and going back to the negotiating table, as the current administration or our next administration seems to be interested in doing?
Well, here, let me try on both of those. And if I'm not mistaken, those came from Ellie Jeremiah and Norm, and then some
Yeah.
others as well. Yes.
Some others, more questions. Yes.
So very good questions. And I'm really glad with the types of really good questions and people we're getting on this discussion. Look, my take is I'm not advocating, I wouldn't advocate right now in the current environment for the US to come out guns blazing with a series of strikes, in a new administration, for example. I would argue for re-engagement and diplomacy, but also for a clear message to come with that diplomacy that says and we're going to de-escalate and you're going to stop doing what you're doing in Iraq. And then if actions like that continue in Iraq, then I think the US has space to respond. And with this type of action to also send a message. And we've done that in the past. And I think the Israelis are capable, have shown that they're capable, that while there is risk there, it's also Iran won't automatically respond. In the past, it hasn't necessarily stopped all dialogue and communication. I would prefer for it all to stop on both sides. But if it's not going to stop, I think that we have space to simultaneously be negotiating with Iran and when necessary, using, these types of tools in a limited way. I also don't think we're necessarily looking at a forever war. Like Israel might be looking at a forever war on its border because it lives there, right? It has no choice, as Sarit said. But for the US, I don't think we're looking at a forever war, partially because I think we have a much more powerful deterrent capability when we use it. The Iranians really don't want to get into a direct conflict with us. They know that, when the US fights big, it's just a whole different ballgame. And that's why they spent 40 years developing a strategy that avoids that kind of direct confrontation. And that gives us a fair dose of leverage where one limited strike combined with the right kind of messaging, if Iran crosses a line, should be enough in many cases to deter Iran, at least for a while. You might need to do it every once in a while, but I don't think you're necessarily looking at the same level and types of strikes that you get out of that Israel has had to conduct. And I probably would not recommend for the United States a campaign that focuses on attriting Iranian capabilities, more a campaign focused on deterring Iranian actions, because I think that can be much more limited in scope. I think those are ways to deal with those questions, but there's legitimate questions because every action has risk associated with it. Sarit mentioned that Soleimani, while you didn't end up in a war, well, maybe the risk was worth it. In my view, the risk wasn't worth it. I think, and the way it was done, got us very, very close. And I do think that we were at least partially lucky. I don't think Iran wanted to kill Americans with its response when it launched all those ballistic missiles. And its missiles turned out to be quite accurate, which is interesting and disturbing at the same time. But they clearly demonstrated a willingness to at least risk killing Americans and getting into a broader conflict than that. And so, I think if our objective was to deter future attacks on US forces in Iraq, the Soleimani strike went way beyond that. And if anything, I think escalated the situation. So I just don't even think it really achieved our objectives either, or depending on what those objectives are. So anyway, that's where I'll leave it. I guess the bottom line of all that is if you're very limited and you know what you want to accomplish and you pair it with very clear messaging to key players, this doesn't have to end diplomacy or lead you into a forever war context. But yeah, there are certainly risks associated with it.
Nick, did you have anything to add to those questions?
Just very quickly to build off of Ilan's point, if we just look at the Syrian theater, it can take on, this sort of campaign can take on the features of an indefinite campaign because the opponent can continue to unfold its campaign plan. Just look at the Golan, for example. Sarit mentioned a forthcoming report on the Golan file as an example. The Golan is a very interesting example of how Iran has a determined campaign plan to utilize Syrian territory to be able to increase the aperture of its range of attacks on Israel via the Galilee, southern Lebanon, Gaza, and the Golan in Syria. And the types of personnel and resources that Iran has dedicated to the Golan, despite Israeli attempts to prevent it from using the Golan as a springboard for future attacks, demonstrates its commitment. It had Jihad Mughniya, the son of now slain Imad Mughniya, one of Hezbollah's head operatives, who was actually killed by an Israeli strike in January 2015. How did Iran respond? It responded by assigning Ali Dakduk, who is one of the key Iranian-backed Hezbollah network operatives responsible for building its multinational, transnational Hezbollah network of fighters, as well as one of the real evil men who was able to scale up attacks against US forces using advanced IEDs in Iraq. And they've shown this level of commitment. They've entered the Golan in southern Syria in the social, political, and security space. And so that just demonstrates that this type of campaign is just one tool that you need. There are other tools that you need to apply: diplomatic, political, potentially economic, and sanctions in order to deter or defend consistently against a determined opponent, because it's not going away in southern Syria for the Israelis. And for the United States and the broader region, there'll have to be multiple lines of effort simultaneously. This isn't just the line of effort you can pursue.
So with an eye on time, I'll ask a final round of questions, then I turn it to you guys to answer and also provide any closing remarks or points you'd like to make. This is kind of combining themes from questions from Zora Akrami, Russ Hoyle, and even a second question from Ali Garan-Maya. You know, one of the things that we referenced in our presentation was kind of the applicability of some of these lessons to US actions in Iraq. So if we could pull that thread a little bit more about how this would translate into a campaign in a place like Iraq, where the US does have, you know, maybe more interest to satisfy that third party than Israel does with the Assad regime in Syria, and some of the fallout that we've already seen from US actions there, kind of what are the most important lessons to implement there, and how could the US implement them?
Sure. So I think that a few things, I mean, really a number of the lessons in there that I would apply is, like, one, the messaging, the very loud and proud responses that we've conducted in Iraq only embarrassed the Iraqi government, put it in a very difficult position, and, you know, provoke the Iranians to keep escalating, as opposed to, you know, quiet, you know, under the radar strikes with private messages to the Iranians. And you don't have to tell the Iraqis in advance you're doing it, but you do have to, or tell them specific targets and things you're doing, because I get the challenge, the intelligence challenges there, but you can do more in that space to coordinate with them and at least, you know, warn them some. Again, reduce, you're not going to reduce some of the Iraqi backlash, but you're going to manage it, just like you can't fully reduce, the Israelis can't fully reduce the Russian backlash sometimes, especially when things go bad, but they have been able to reduce it. So I think that's one key. Both the messaging and the diplomacy might be two of the most important things. And then also, I'll just give you another example, you know, that comes back to me. You know, back in late December, one American contractor was killed, and we responded with strikes that killed 25 KH fighters. That inevitably was going to trigger a response, right, from KH, which involved, you know, storming of the American embassy, which then triggered killing Soleimani, which then triggered the Iranian response. You know, in some ways, the biggest mistake in all of that was the initial response on those 5 facilities. You know, if you have enough intelligence and you're accurate enough with what you do, you know, you don't need, like, you need to be proportionate in your response. And in that case, we weren't. And that's part of what triggered the escalation. So again, I think there are ways to deter, you know, Iranian proxies in Iraq without both going against our fundamental objectives of keeping a strong relationship with the Iraqi government, and not also unnecessarily risking escalation that that's not in our interest, and frankly not in Iran's interest or Iraq's interest or anybody else. So those are just some of the lessons, but I almost think you can take every one of the lessons of the campaign and apply it right now in the report and apply it right now to what is happening in Iraq and how maybe, and ask yourself, based on this, what should the US be doing in Iraq?
Nick, any final remarks?
To build off what Ilan said, really you need to emphasize that it isn't completely in the hands of either actor. In the United States and Iraq, in Israel with Syria, you do require active political and diplomatic engagement. The Israelis depend on Russia ultimately to be able to manage the threat from Iran coming from Syria. The United States ultimately is dependent on a partnership with the Iraqi government and elements within Iraqi society that want to have a more balanced Iraq between multiple different actors and not just a unilateral actor in Iran. And we will all have to follow closely Secretary Pompeo's effort for strategic dialogue, because Iran and its proxies have an active, multi-pronged line of effort, both in terms of kinetic and political pressure to expel the US from Iraq. And if the strategic dialogue does not work, it is uncertain if the US will be able to remain in Iraq in the long term.
Well, on that positive note, and an eye that we went a couple of minutes over time, want to thank everyone for joining us for this session today. Please do take a look at the entire report, which is now live on the CNAS website. Great questions, and we got to most of them, I believe. So thank you everyone so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.